Hello and welcome. In this module we're covering Deontic ethics, also known as Kantian ethics. A good one-liner for Kantian ethics is the Latin phrase fiat justitia ruat caelum, meaning let justice be done though the heavens fall. So let's get started on the structura of Deontic ethics. You should be able to construct this yourself, at least in general terms. You should also be asking yourself how your own metaphysical structure, your own hierarchy of values, is related to these ideas, and how the benefits and drawbacks of these theories are affecting your own ideas of values. For my students, I also suggest going back to your ethics survey from the beginning of the semester and working out which of your answers belongs to which ethical theory, and whether they're compatible or whether the different answers contradict each other, and if so, which ones will you modify? So what are the axioms of Deontic ethics? Well, the starting point is that all humans are rational, or at least they have the potential to be so. This is a claim about human nature, and notice again that this is the kind of statement where you can't coherently ask why. If you did, you could only get a "because we say so" as an answer. The proper way for humans to relate to the universe is through goodwill, and for Kant that is a rational and universal consideration of all actions through the lens of rationally universal application. This is the axiom of relating human nature to nature. Now notice that Kant isn't going to tell us his axiom regarding the nature of the universe, just like the utilitarians. But again, we can work that out pretty easily. We have a rational human nature that is given as a universal. And the right way to relate to the universe is through rational, universal, and orderly consideration. Well, combine these ideas and you get the nature of the universe. The universe is rational, orderly, and homogeneous. Homogeneous here just means that all ideas work the same everywhere. They are all universal. I'm using the term homogeneous instead of universal because we will have to use phrases like homogeneous universe, and saying universal universe just sounds wrong. How do we know this? Well, if the universe was not rational, the rational human nature and the rational relation of human nature to the universe would not be possible. If the universe was not orderly, we could not apply reason to it, because you cannot rationally understand chaos. Additionally, you can't have universal application of ideas in a chaotic space, because any space that is not orderly cannot be understood to be uniform throughout, so the universal part of the description would fail. If the universe was not homogeneous, universal ideas could not be universally applicable. You would get one set of rules here and a different set of rules there, and so on. Reason would lose the ability to be universal because reason works on universals. Alright, now that we have the axioms, let's get to the theory. The first point in the theory is that all things that are rational must be universally functional. Functional here means something like you have to be able to apply the idea universally without getting a contradiction. If you got a contradiction, then the idea is not universal. And any idea that is not universal is somehow incoherent. Since the universe is rational and homogeneous, any idea that is coherent must also be rational and homogeneous. 2. There are actions that are universally mandatory and universally prohibited, and these are called rational duties. Since actions come from ideas, that is your intentions, and ideas have to be universally functional, actions must also be universally functional. And that means that you have exactly two kinds of actions. 1, actions that are rational and universal, and 2, actions which are incoherent because they lack rationality or universality. We can determine the status of any action by the use of reason to check whether it is actually rational and universal. Any action that is mandatory is an action that a person needs to do if they were acting rationally. And any action that is prohibited is an action that a person must not do if they are acting rationally. 3. Emotions, desires, preferences, and passions are not rational, and therefore they cannot play part in determining the status of an action. This is no different than saying that because waffle making is not relevant to mathematics, You cannot make a waffle as a legitimate answer to a calculus question. Now, we've already gone over the whole emotion-reason issue at the beginning of the class, but we can refresh. Emotion is a thing that happens to you. It is not a thing you do. And as such, it is outside of your control. It is not rational. It is not stable. And that's because your emotions come and go, so on. So the best you can do is use reason to keep emotions in check. Keep the ones you want out and let the ones you want in. One interesting feature of this combination of ideas is that rules cannot have exceptions. There cannot be a contextually relevant feature of a decision that somehow negates the rule or that makes an exception. Why would you want an exception anyway? Because the consequences would otherwise be not preferable. But your like or dislike for the consequences is a matter of personal preference. And we just said that emotion, desire, passion, and preference cannot coherently play part in ethical decisions. And that means that Kantian ethics can never care about consequences. They cannot have exceptions. They're never interested in the context because they are always absolute. And this also means that in Kantian ethics, there cannot be a hierarchy of values. And this is because there is only one value, rational universality. No rational duty is ever more important than any other because they're always exactly the same. Without any possibility of elevating one over another, we cannot ever construct a hierarchy of values. This means that all actions that are permissible are ones that can be universalized. Thus, Kant's first categorical imperative, quote, act only according to that maxim by which you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. Now notice that this is just a focused rephrasing of the theory as derived from the axioms. And 6, if we think about it, we notice that another universal rule can be pulled from that first categorical imperative, which Kant then calls his second categorical imperative. Quote, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any others, always as an end and never as a means only. Alright, so this one needs some explanation. When we interact with other people, we inherently use them to get something we want. And that means that we are using them as a means to some end that we have, as a way of getting to what we want. This is because all interactions we engage in are ones where we seek some kind of benefit for ourselves. You hang out with your friends because it is fun. You want the significant other because they provide certain benefits. You don't feel alone, and so on. You're using me as you watch this video. Using me to get an education, to pass a class, etc. At the same time, I'm using you. Teaching is what I do for a living, so technically I get paid by you to do this. Now, none of this is really a problem for Kant. We use each other, big whoop. The point he is making is that as we use each other, we can't only use each other. Why not? To use someone as a mere means is to turn that person into an object. Their entire worth is reduced to what I can get out of them. So long as I get what I want, nothing else about them matters. As far as I'm concerned, they can go die in a fire as soon as I'm done using them. Now that's the problem, because I can't make that attitude universal. If I did, I would have to rationally want to be treated that way myself. But I can't do that. I have goals, and in fact, I'm using others to help achieve my goals. And that means that I need them to help me. If I was okay with objectifying and using people, then I would have to be okay with people objectifying and using me. But that actually prevents me from getting what I want. And the contradiction becomes clear. To get what I want by merely using people, I would have to want others to merely use me, which would then prevent me from getting what I want. So how do we interact properly? Well, I can't help using you any more than you can help using me. But it doesn't have to stop there. Treating people as ends in themselves is about recognizing that their ideas, goals, and so on are just as important as mine. Or rather, I have to treat them that way. So I need to help you to get to your goals, and you need to help me to get to mine. Yes, I teach and I get paid, but you're also here for an education. So I have to teach in the best way I can to further your education, or at least attempt to do so. I also can't make the class impassable because you're also here to pass a class. And yes, you hang out with your friends because it's fun, but you have a responsibility to help your friends reach their own goals, so you can't just be a fair weather friend. Alright, so much for theory. Let's take a look at the practice. The practice of Deontic ethics can be summed up as act in a universally rational way and embody the goodwill by acting only in ways that are in line with the categorical imperative, without regard for context, outcome, or emotions. Alright, so let's try that in English this time. And let's assume that we're dealing with a new kind of problem, since any choices you've worked out before have to have the same conclusions, because they're universal and eternal. When you're faced with a choice, you abstract out what you're thinking for a solution. That is, you get rid of the context and emotions, and next, you try to see whether that idea could be made into a universal maxim without becoming self-contradictory. And remember to ignore the consequences, because that is an emotionally based consideration. If you can't turn it into a universal maxim, then check against whether it treats other people as means only or also as ends. And if it treats them as ends, then you have an action that you're supposed to do. Now, if you can't get a universal maxim out of the idea, then it is an action that you're prohibited from doing. And once you work this out one time, it applies for all time. Finally, what does the Kantian world look like? The world, when properly arranged, gives us a stable, sustainable, rational, universal, and immutable society of rational rights and responsibilities. Okay? Why? Well, if the universe is rational, orderly, and homogeneous, and your behavior can dial into that, the result is that any society would be fully harmonious with the universe. Look at that description again. The first 5 descriptors can be said of the speed of light, or gravity, or any other universal force. The rights and responsibilities, that's just what happens when you make an entity with free will dial into the universal laws. On the other hand, an improperly arranged world would look like this: an emotionally unstable, chaotic world with an irrational pursuit of individual preferences at the expense of the rest of the world. Alright, why emotionally unstable? Because Kantian system sees rationality as universal. You can't use reason and somehow end up with an unstable system any more than you can end up with different answers to the same math question. And the pursuit of individual preferences is the only alternative to universal rationality. Personal preferences can be preferences of individuals or groups, since every individual in that group who is pushing for that behavior also personally prefers it. Okay, so that's the layout. What are some benefits of the system? Well, first, you have the universal character of the system. All humans participate in it. Second, in that participation, all people can use the same universal reason to arrive at the exact same solution, and that is, you don't need a source of authority outside of reason itself. Third, the system itself is immutable, which means that once a solution is found, it's there forever. There's no need to worry about this piece of context or that, no need to worry about predicting consequences. The right is always right, the wrong is always wrong. You learn it once, and you're done. Another benefit, though a tangential one, is that this system has many of the hallmarks of certain religious ideas. Things like the 10 Commandments and so forth have the same universal and immutable character that takes no notice of context. Murder is wrong, no matter the circumstances. Now, the benefit of that is that, at least here in the West, we are all at least already familiar with this approach, and that makes it relatively easy to grasp. Finally, because the rules are universal, there is no way of coherently having a difference in morality between the rich and the poor, the educated and the ignorant, famous and average, individual or state. The same rules apply to every person, group, collective, and entity in the exact same way with the exact same force. It is just as morally wrong for you to lie as it is for a doctor to do so, or the President of the United States to do so. The system of justice that would be produced by this system would also be entirely without bias, because things like race and gender can't have any possible bearing on the rule, because it is ultimately irrelevant by being part of the context. Alright, so what are some of the drawbacks? Well, the biggest drawback has already been noted. There is no hierarchy to values. Each universal maxim has the exact same absolute force. There is no way of putting one value above the other. And this matters because, point 2, without a hierarchy of values, there is no way to resolve the problem of conflicting obligations. Anytime you have two or more obligations and they happen to be mutually exclusive, meaning that if you do one you can't do the other, there is no way to determine what you should do, and no matter what you pick, you chose wrong. Let's look at an example. You make a promise to your friend that you will help him hide from ISIS, which is looking to murder him. Now you can make this promise because you can turn it into a maxim. You should help people escape from unjust persecution. Is there a rational conflict here? No. Since the persecution is unjust, that means that the person needing to escape is not in breach of some obligation, so they haven't actually done anything wrong. The people doing the hunting are the unjust one. Opposing injustice is rational as long as you're not in breach of any of your own responsibilities. And so you hide your friend, and then ISIS busts through your door and demands to know whether you're hiding your friend or if you're aiding people in escaping from their unjust torture and execution. And here you end up with conflicting obligations. You made a promise to hide and so protect your friend, and that is an absolute obligation. You also cannot lie. That is an absolute obligation. Therefore you should, what? There is no way to resolve the problem here because there is no way to rank your obligations in terms of more or less important. A great example of this is found in the Game of Thrones. Spoiler warning. Jon Snow is a kind of Kantian. He takes his obligations, and especially his oaths, as absolutely binding. So when he joins the Night's Watch, his oath is absolutely binding on him to the point where he has to die to be free of it. And then he takes an oath to protect the people as the king in the north. And then he takes an oath to serve and protect Daenerys. And then she goes and murders people indiscriminately. And here's the problem. Jon's oath to protect the people is absolute. Jon's oath of obedience to Dany is absolute. But if he protects people, he disobeys Dany. And if he obeys Dany, then he betrays the people. And since he can't place those obligations in a hierarchy because they're equally absolute, he is lost. That, by the way, seems to be part of why Jon can't be king, because he's ultimately morally compromised, at least by his own standards. But the most problematic of theoretical problems is that for Kantian ethics to actually work, he needs God. Now, this is not a popular opinion, since Kant is supposed to be about pure reason and not about religion, but he admits as much in his own words. Now, think back to the problem we raised in reading Plato's Republic. How can the most just man be better off than the most unjust man? Everything that's materially measurable weighs infinitely in favor of the unjust man. And here, Kant resolves the issue by saying that the actual reward for the just man has to be provided by a just universe. But that makes no sense in a purely material and secular universe. There is no justice to be had in rocks, tables, and squirrels. The just man suffers for his justice and dies. There is no justice in what happens to him. In terms of Plato's setup, the most just man has suffered injustice. How can we fix this grave error? How can it still be better to be just than unjust? And here Kant is forced to go back to the idea of God as a way to enforce the reward and punishment. He can do away with God as a source of authority, because Kant says that we can all figure out the correct way to behave by being rational. But the enforcement of that system is lacking, unless there is some kind of a higher power of some sort that will ultimately enforce the system. So Kant concludes that the just man will just be magically better off because the universe will take care of it. Kantian ethics seem great until you dig a bit deeper. The absolute nature of his rules is nice, but it leaves you without a hierarchy, and we need to be able to distinguish between major and minor issues. The idea that consequences don't matter is great until you realize that this approach means doing the right thing by saving one person at the expense of the rest of humanity. And thus the phrase fiat justitia ruat caelum, meaning let justice be done though the heavens fall. The rational basis also seems great, but it demands that everyone be and act exactly the same way. So what happens if somebody has a different idea? Well, then you force him to repent and be just like everybody else. Yep, that's a bit of an authoritarian overtone to the theory. Now for our next module, we'll look at one way of trying to fix Kant's problem of the hierarchy of values, as well as the cost of doing the right thing. If you have comments or questions, feel free to email me or leave it in the comments, and I'll see you all next time.